I'll be speaking to Allison Weir, who is president of the Council for the National Interest and executive director of If Americans Knew. And with that group, she specialized in showing how the U.S. media vastly underreported the violence done to Palestinians. CNI concentrates on Israel-Palestine, and its website says its goal is to restore a political environment in America in which voters and their elected officials are free from the undue influence and pressure of foreign countries and their partisans. Weir has written a book called Against Our Better Judgment: The Hidden History of How the U.S. Was used to create Israel. She'll be speaking Thursday, May 21st at the New Haven Public Library at 7. Good evening.
Hi, thank you for inviting me on your show.
Now, CNI wants the U.S. to be free from this undue influence. So what country are we talking about? What partisans?
Well, the Israel partisans, the Israel lobby, as many people now know, but a surprising number still are not aware, is extremely influential in setting our Middle East policies and in the candidates that we have the choice, which candidates are electable or are not electable.
Mm-hmm. And just huge influence I see now in the trade agreement, that TPP. Doesn't sound like it has anything to do with Israel. It's Asia, but there's something in there about trying to fight that it would fight BDS in this trade agreement.
That's right. They've added some amendments that start talking about the settlements in a way that would sort of semi-legalize them, even though the U.S. policy has always been that these are illegal, which is the international, what the international law says that they're illegal. But now there's new language that's being slipped into this trade bill, and yet it's very little of that is being discussed in the U.S. media. And it's hard to even find a copy of the bill with the new amendments that have been put in.
Now, you call your book Against Our Better Judgment. Nowadays, it appears that the Israeli government gets lockstep 100% support from every part of the U.S. government. But back in the 40s, things were different. Is that right?
That's right, the 40s and before. Most sectors of American society, especially the establishment, were not in favor of supporting Zionism. And many sectors of the public as well, both many Christian leaders, there were Jewish individuals and organizations that were opposed to supporting Zionism. The State Department and the Pentagon both had many memos and studies saying that supporting this movement to create a Jewish state on land that was the large majority of whose inhabitants were not Jewish would be wrong. It would be damaging to American interests. It would end up hurting Americans, and it should not be supported by the United States. So this was the kind of judgment that most people had in the United States.
What about FDR? How did he feel? Did he get involved, or was it so much concentration on World War II?
Well, he was, of course, mostly concentrated on World War II, but it looked like he was starting to learn the situation, what Zionism would mean for the Middle East, what kind of problems it would cause, how vastly unjust it would be to the people living there. At the end of his life, it looked like he was becoming aware of that. And it's interesting to wonder what he might have done if he had lived. But he did try to do some things, but he wasn't able to do much. And then, of course, Truman came in.
Now, what was Truman's opinions? Was he always a strong supporter of Israel, or did something change in him?
He was not always a strong supporter of Zionism. In fact, in some of his private papers, it showed that he actually felt the one-state solution in which Jews, Christians, and Muslims would all live together with equal rights in a democracy was really what he thought was the best solution. But he was coming under great pressure. He was in a close campaign against Dewey. Dewey's campaign was already taking strong stands in favor of Zionism, supporting creating a Jewish state in Palestine. And Truman felt that he had to do the same thing. They were both looking for money and influence that would be important to their campaigns. So Truman took the same stand. Some of his major donors uh, desired that stand. When he took that position, then he got massive amounts of money. And it was some of that money that really financed his famous whistle stop tour, the train tour in which he was campaigning for the presidency.
And nowadays, you see the name Truman, and well, it's inevitable. But back in '48, he was quite the underdog in that election.
That's right. That's right.
So anything that supported him and helped him could be looked at as, key, or I suppose he looked at it that way. Everything was important.
That's right. And his, key political advisor, Clark Clifford was, sorry, Clifford was recommending that to get elected, he take that position. At the same time that his domestic political advisors were saying to take that position, his Secretary of State, George Marshall, was outraged. He told Truman, don't sacrifice U.S. interests just for an election. I won't even vote for you if you sacrifice what's best for America just for the sake of winning an election. But, like most politicians, in the end, they want to win the election and they do what it takes. And Truman did that.
And we've had a lot more of that ever since.
That's right. That's right. Both parties, we see it through today. Both parties are, again, the candidates are always, vying with one another about who can come across as the most devoted to Israel. Even after their massacres, and we see more and more people killed in Gaza and in the West Bank, presidential candidates talk about how devoted they are to Israel and how much they will support Israel if they are elected.
Now, I wanted to sort of really get in close on this question of who is the dog and who is the tail. Because you get scholars like Noam Chomsky who think that the Israelis are more being used by U.S. elites to further the cause of empire, and he says that the wars and regime change the U.S. does in the Middle East is really not much different from what it does elsewhere. I take it you differ from that opinion.
I do. I think he's very mistaken. There's a great deal of evidence, current evidence and past evidence, that in this particular case, it's the tail wagging the dog. There are, other scholars, and two of them are John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, who wrote a book talking about the power of the Israel lobby, documenting it, quite thoroughly. Chomsky mainly just doesn't really use evidence to promote his interpretation. He just uses theory because there's really not much evidence to support his theory that it's the U.S. somehow using Israel. Let's look at Israel. It's a tiny country. It has no natural resources. When it began, it had even fewer people. It had no economy to speak of. And we had good relations with the Arab countries that had the strategic commodity, which is oil. So yes, oil is very important to the United States. It's important, policymakers take that into account. And therefore, policymakers were saying we need to maintain our very close, friendly relationships with the Arabs, which is what we had at that time. And they said if we support Zionism, this will jeopardize those relationships, will hurt the United States, and therefore we should not do it. This was being said by not only the Secretary of Defense, it was being said by top people in Near Eastern affairs, and I think sometimes it was called the Western Asia Department. The Pentagon was saying it, the intelligence agencies were saying the same thing. Even one man who was a very important part, considered one of the major figures in the Cold War, fighting the Cold War, was also talking about Zionism as being damaging to United States interests and even strategic interests.
Now, I know you're going to go into this a lot more in your talk in a few days in New Haven. So I just want to close by asking about your background. Now, you don't have any ethnic connection to the area, as I understand. You're a journalist and an editor, or you were, before you became the CNI president. And you became interested in the politics of the area fairly recently. Is that right?
That's right. Well, it seems, recently in my life, it was 15 years ago that I finally got curious about it. I don't have a connection to Israel-Palestine. I had certainly always been sympathetic towards Israel. But when the second uprising began, called the Second Intifada, began in fall of 2000, I just randomly decided to pay attention. I was a small town journalist, so this wasn't for my work, but just out of curiosity, I thought I would pay attention to the issue and learn what it was about and be up to date with the latest news on it. And when I paid attention to it as a journalist, I quickly noticed that it seemed to me very one-sided, that we were hearing about Israelis much more than we were hearing about and from Palestinians. I began, therefore, to go on the internet because I got more and more curious. Well, what is the full story? On the internet, I discovered excellent Israeli media and Palestinian media and other reports where I could learn what was actually going on day by day, was extremely shocked at what I learned, how little of it was really being reported in the American media across the political spectrum. So after a few months of that, I decided this was such a significant issue, and it seemed to me such a major cover-up, that I quit my job in Northern California and traveled over to Gaza and the West Bank as a freelance reporter. And there I saw what was going on there, and when I came back, I started an organization called If Americans Knew, just to tell all Americans the facts on what's going on there and our connection to it.
Well, thank you so much for this interview, and of course we'll be listening Thursday in New Haven for more about this.
Thanks very much.